It was rough. Musicians union was there, but they weren't of much help at the time. I was never happy. I guess what drives me to tear things apart.
A researched script based on verified interviews and documented accounts. Direct quotes are drawn from published, on-record interviews, Guitar Player, Guitar World, Rolling Stone, and others, cited at the end of each section. He didn't hate them. That's the twist nobody wants in a video with a title like this one, but it's the true one. Eddie Van Halen spent his career being compared to, copied by, and occasionally snubbed by the guitarists he grew up idolizing. He talked about all of it, on the record, for decades. Some of those conversations were warm. Some were bitter. A couple of them ended actual professional relationships. None of them were secret. What follows isn't a list of feuds invented for a thumbnail. It's what Eddie Van Halen actually said, in his own words, about 6 guitarists who mattered to him, and what they said back. The real version is stranger, funnier, and more human than any fabricated hate list could be. Let's start with the man who made him pick up a guitar in the first place. Long before Eruption, before the Frankenstrat, before any of it, there was a teenager in Pasadena wearing out a stack of Cream records. In a 1978 interview with Jazz Obrecht, the very first magazine profile Eddie Van Halen ever gave, he named the guitarist who mattered most to his development, and it surprised even the interviewer. It wasn't Hendrix. It wasn't a flashy technician. It was Eric Clapton. Eddie explained that Clapton was the main one, adding that he knew he didn't sound anything like him. Obrecht pointed out that Eddie's own playing seemed closer in spirit to Hendrix or Ritchie Blackmore, more aggressive, more technical. Eddie agreed that was true on the surface, but insisted Clapton was the guitarist he'd actually obsessed over. He said he knew every solo Clapton had ever played, note for note, and that he could still play them today. As a kid, he would sit with the records for hours, slowing them down, learning every bend and phrase by ear. That devotion is documented and undisputed. What's less well known is what happened when the roles reversed, when Clapton was asked, years later, what he thought of the kid who'd worshipped him. In a 1985 Guitar Player interview, Clapton was characteristically candid. He said that if Van Halen liked his playing, then presumably Van Halen liked the same things he did, and yet Van Halen had gone somewhere Clapton didn't fully understand. He admitted Eddie was extremely fast, and that to his own ears, a lot of the playing went over the top, which he attributed to his own preference for a simpler approach. He even acknowledged hearing that Eddie had slowed down his records to study the solos, calling it real dedication, and admitting he wasn't quite sure how to respond to that kind of tribute. It wasn't an insult exactly. Clapton was careful to frame it as a difference in taste and background, not a dismissal of skill. He suggested that if Eddie could recognize the blues roots in Clapton's playing, specifically citing Robert Johnson, and still choose to build something so radically different, then Eddie was clearly onto something real, even if Clapton himself couldn't fully articulate what it was. Read in full context, it's less a takedown and more an older guitarist admitting he didn't have the vocabulary to process what a younger one had done with the same instrument. Still, coverage of the exchange over the decades has often flattened it into a simple insult. Clapton says Van Halen has no soul, which isn't quite what happened, and isn't what Eddie himself seemed to take from it. There's no on-record instance of Eddie firing back at Clapton in anger. What exists instead is a much more revealing 2011 Rolling Stone conversation, conducted for the magazine's Greatest Guitarists poll, in which Eddie put Clapton at the very top of his own list of influences. He talked at length about why. The simplicity, the tone, the fact that Clapton plugged straight into a Marshall and let the instrument do the talking. Eddie explained that this was part of what led him to build his own guitar, cross-pollinating a Stratocaster body with humbucker electronics because neither a stock Fender nor a stock Gibson gave him exactly what he wanted. In that same interview, Eddie also offered a genuinely sharp piece of music criticism about his hero, noting that Clapton's playing had changed noticeably after his Cream years, once he moved into a more song-based, blues rock mode with Delaney and Bonnie and beyond. Eddie theorized that it was actually Cream's rhythm section, Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, who had pushed Clapton to play at that ferocious late-60s level in the first place, two jazz-trained musicians essentially daring him to keep up. It's the kind of detailed, admiring, technical analysis you only get from someone who has spent a lifetime studying another player's catalog. So, no hate list entry here. What's documented is a lopsided but genuine relationship, a student who never stopped studying, and a teacher who was honest, sometimes bluntly so, about not fully understanding what the student built. Eddie Van Halen spent his whole career citing Eric Clapton as his single greatest influence, right up through his final major interviews. That's not a rivalry. That's a debt he never stopped acknowledging. Sources: Guitar Player, November 1978, Jazz Obrecht. Guitar Player, July 1985, Rolling Stone, November 2011. If Clapton shaped Eddie's ear, Ritchie Blackmore shaped his sense of drama. Deep Purple's Burn and Highway Star were part of Eddie's practice regimen as a teenager, and in a 2015 conversation with Billboard about his all-time favorite riffs, he singled out Burn specifically. Blackmore's combination of classical phrasing and hard rock aggression, plus his aggressive use of the whammy bar, left a real mark on how Eddie approached his own instrument. The actual first encounter story between them isn't the frosty stare-down often repeated online. It's better, and it's on the record from Eddie himself, recounted in interviews and echoed in Van Halen oral histories. As a teenager playing local clubs, Eddie ran into Blackmore and John Bonham together at the Rainbow Bar and Grill in Los Angeles. Starstruck, he went over to introduce himself to the guitarist he'd grown up idolizing. According to Eddie's own retelling, both men looked at him, asked who he was, and told him to get lost. There's also a separate, later encounter, recounted by guitarist Gary Moore, in which someone tried to formally introduce Eddie to Blackmore at an event. Moore recalled making the introduction and watching Blackmore simply walk away without engaging, leaving both Moore and Eddie unsure what had just happened. Whatever the reason, Blackmore has long had a reputation, even among his own bandmates, for being famously private and difficult to read. The pattern repeats: warmth offered, warmth not returned. Professionally, the relationship stayed complicated well into the 1990s. In a 1991 Guitar World interview, Blackmore was asked directly about two-handed tapping, the technique Eddie had popularized. His answer was double-edged. He said he was glad the tapping trend had run its course, tracing the technique back to guitarist Harvey Mandel, whom he claimed to have seen doing something similar at the Whiskey A Go-Go back in 1968. But in the same conversation, when asked directly about Eddie, Blackmore's tone shifted into real respect. He called Eddie probably the most influential guitarist of the previous 15 years, noting, half as a joke, that an entire generation had gone out and bought locking nut guitars because of him. He added that he was more impressed by Eddie's later songwriting and keyboard work than by the guitar pyrotechnics, and speculated that Eddie could end up remembered the way Cole Porter is remembered, not for flash, but for songs. By the mid-1990s, in comments to Classic Rock, Blackmore observed that Eddie seemed to have grown tired of being the guitar hero, noting that Eddie had increasingly turned toward keyboards and songwriting rather than pure guitar showmanship, which Blackmore seemed to read as a kind of restlessness with his own legend. After Eddie's death in 2020, Blackmore's public tribute dropped any ambivalence entirely. He wrote that Eddie Van Halen was a brilliant guitarist who had started a technique that an entire generation of players went on to copy, and he called him the ultimate guitar hero. So the real Blackmore story isn't hatred. It's distance. A genuinely cold couple of personal encounters, sitting alongside decades of real professional respect that Blackmore was, by his own admission, sometimes too guarded to express directly to Eddie's face. Sources: Guitar World, 1991, Classic Rock, 1995, Billboard, 2015, Gary Moore Interview Archives, Blackmore's 2020 Tribute Statement. The Joe Perry story is really two stories, and both are real, and they contradict each other in exactly the way actual human relationships do. Story 1. Irritation, then admiration, from Perry's side. In a joint interview with Rick Beato years later, Perry and Aerosmith co-guitarist Brad Whitford both admitted their first reaction to Van Halen's debut album wasn't awe, it was confusion bordering on annoyance. Perry said flatly that at first it was kind of annoying, because he and Whitford didn't fully understand what Eddie was doing technically. They knew fragments of tapping-adjacent techniques from other players, but nothing that sounded like this. He compared the feeling to hearing Jeff Beck for the first time, a player operating somewhere just out of reach. But Perry has said repeatedly, across multiple separate interviews over the years, that the annoyance didn't last. He's called Van Halen's playing incredible, said Eddie turned guitar playing on its ear, and, in a particularly candid moment discussing why he left Aerosmith in 1979, admitted that hearing that first Van Halen record made him feel Aerosmith wasn't ready for the new decade. That's not diplomatic praise. That's a guitarist in a massively successful band admitting a rival act rattled his confidence in his own group. Story 2. The Cold Shoulder, from Eddie's side, and it's one of the more quietly painful things Eddie Van Halen said in print. In a 1982 interview with Jazz Obrecht, discussing the early days of Van Halen's rise, Eddie described touring as a young, hungry unknown and running into established players who wouldn't so much as acknowledge him. He specifically named Joe Perry and Ritchie Blackmore, saying that guys like that would give him the cold shoulder. No hello, no warmth, nothing, and contrasted it with his own personality, insisting that wasn't how he operated. He offered a theory for it too, that some older, established players felt threatened by what he and his generation were doing, and simply didn't extend themselves to help anyone coming up behind them. Both things are true at once. Perry, by his own account, was somewhere between confused and rattled by what he was hearing on record, while, according to Eddie, offering nothing but a blank look in person. It's a very believable version of how two working musicians on parallel arena tours in the late 1970s might have actually interacted. Mutual respect that neither one was in a position or a mood to show at the time. The ending is unambiguous, though. By 2013, in an interview later republished by Van Halen News Desk, Perry was describing Eddie in almost reverent terms, calling him a gifted natural talent, someone who reinvented guitar playing the way Hendrix once had, taking a familiar instrument and making it sound like something else entirely. He talked about inviting Eddie and Steven Tyler to hang out, and marveled that he'd never seen Eddie without a guitar in his hands. After Eddie's death in 2020, Perry gave interviews reflecting on him with the same warmth, calling Van Halen an incredible band at their peak and Eddie the leader of an entirely new generation of players. So, not a hate list entry. A slow-burn relationship that started with mutual wariness on a shared bill and ended in genuine, repeatedly stated admiration, on both sides, just at different speeds. Sources: Guitar Player, 1982, Jazz Obrecht. Rick Beato interview, Guitar.com transcript. Ultimate Classic Rock, Guitar World, Van Halen News Desk, 2013. This is the one where Eddie went furthest on record, and where the other man never responded publicly at all, leaving it exactly as one-sided as it sounds. In that same wide-ranging 1979 conversation with Jazz Obrecht, right after discussing another guitarist entirely, more on that next, Eddie brought up Boston's Tom Scholz unprompted. He described a show where Van Halen played immediately before Boston, said he performed his own guitar solo, and claimed that shortly afterward, Scholz performed what sounded to him like the same solo. Eddie called the whole thing strange, particularly because it happened at a daytime show, in front of an audience that could clearly see both performances back to back. That's the entire allegation, in Eddie's own words, and it's worth being precise about it. This is one musician's on-record recollection from decades ago, not a matter that was ever independently confirmed, litigated, or addressed by Scholz. Tom Scholz has a well-documented reputation as an intensely private, famously meticulous engineer-musician. He holds a mechanical engineering degree from MIT, built much of Boston's landmark debut album in a home studio, and later designed the Rockman amplifier system that shaped arena rock guitar tone throughout the 1980s. He has rarely given the kind of loose, candid interviews Eddie regularly gave to Guitar Player, and he never publicly addressed this specific claim. What we can say with confidence: the two men represented almost opposite creative philosophies. Scholz was a self-described perfectionist who treated recording as an engineering problem to be solved with total control. Eddie, by his own repeated description in interviews across decades, treated guitar playing as instinct and feel, famously distrustful of overthinking a performance, arguing that formula was the enemy of feeling. That philosophical gap is real and well documented, even if the specific "he copied my solo" story rests on a single, uncorroborated account from one side. It's also worth noting the broader context Eddie gave in that 1979 interview. He wasn't only talking about Scholz. He was venting, in general, about the strange experience of becoming instantly famous for a signature technique and then watching it show up in other people's sets within a year. Some of it clearly inspired, some of it, in his view, lifted wholesale. Whether the Scholz moment was one or the other is something only two people ever really knew, and one of them never spoke about it. Sources: Guitar Player, 1979, Jazz Obrecht, Eddie Talks Guitars. Boston/Tom Scholz biographical background, various music industry profiles. Of everyone on this list, Rick Derringer is the one case where Eddie didn't just complain. He acted, and the story comes with an ending, told in full by Eddie himself in that same 1979 interview. Derringer wasn't some anonymous opening act. By the late 1970s, he was a genuine rock veteran. He'd fronted the McCoys on the 1965 hit Hang On Sloopy as a teenager, played guitar in the Edgar Winter Group, and scored his own solo hit with Rock and Roll, Hoochie Coo. He was, in Eddie's own words, someone he'd grown up on. According to Eddie, Derringer opened for Van Halen on tour and, during his set, played what Eddie described as his exact guitar solo. Not something inspired by it, but effectively the same piece, note for note. After the show, the two ran into each other in a bar, and Eddie confronted him directly. He told Derringer that he'd grown up listening to him, and asked how he could do this, making clear he didn't mind Derringer using tapping as a technique, but drawing a hard line at playing Eddie's actual melody. By Eddie's account, Derringer, visibly drunk, brushed it off with non-committal agreement. The next night, Eddie says, it happened again, the same solo, and Derringer closed his set with "You Really Got Me," the Kinks cover that Van Halen had already turned into a signature part of their own live show. That was the breaking point. Eddie told him plainly that if he kept it up, he wouldn't be opening for Van Halen anymore, and followed through. Derringer was pulled from the tour. What makes this account more than a simple grudge story is Eddie's own discomfort with it, expressed in the same breath. He admitted it felt messed up, because he had genuinely admired Derringer, had seen him play many times, and, by his own admission, had copied some of Derringer's own playing years earlier. He specifically cited Derringer's guitar work on Johnny Winter's "Still Alive and Well" as proof the man didn't need to copy anyone. In other words, Eddie wasn't claiming the moral high ground of total originality. He was drawing a line specifically around direct, note-for-note replication of his own new material, from someone he considered talented enough to know better.